draw on this intelligence in our personal lives and also with our clients. So that's the topic for today. And I got started in this teaching yoga and dance in the 70s at a psychiatric hospital. And what I noticed was that the patients who did both those classes seemed to get better. Maybe they were going to get better anyway, but it really piqued and supported my curiosity as to how the body itself, its movement and its posture, can be an avenue for therapeutic change. So people often call sensori-motor psychotherapy a body-oriented talking therapy because it includes cognitive and emotional elements. We talk, we work with words, but we draw on the body itself as viable targets for psychotherapeutic intervention and for change, which you're going to learn about. The work is strongly informed by Ron Kurtz, whom I met in the 70s. He was the first body therapist I met, and he really believed that the body held unconscious memories in its posture and movement. So he was my first teacher in how to work with the body in psychotherapy. The work's also influenced by the Rolf method of structural integration, which is a hands-on, deep body work that deals with the fascial layers of the body. So if somebody's shoulders are up like this, Rolfing helps them come down. If somebody's head is forward, Rolfing helps the head come in alignment with the body. So I'm certified in that method, but I wanted to help people learn how to live in a more aligned, healthy way in their bodies. But Rolfing wasn't enough because it's often the psychological issues that will hold the body's tension and the body's patterns in place. So many other disciplines, yoga, Rolfing movement, other movement disciplines also contributed to this work. And then later, primarily in the late 80s and 90s, we started studying in the fields of dissociation, neuroscience, trauma-informed care, and more recently, sociocultural perspectives. So that's a little bit of history of this method. So look, let's talk about the wisdom of the body. One of the ways that the body is so intelligent is that the body will adapt automatically without any conscious intent to whatever happens to us, including traumatic events, whether they're perpetrated by individuals, by groups, by society as a whole, as in systemic oppression, racism, colonization, transphobia, and so forth. Our bodies will adjust, we'll tighten up, we'll collapse, we'll have different postures and movements that help us navigate traumatic events. And then there's also relational strife, which is a little bit different, which we'll learn about. It has more to do with the misattunements of people that are important to us. Our attachment figures, our caregivers, our families, our peers, and really anybody who's significant to us, right, can misattune. And we receive an implicit message from that, like maybe we're not good enough, or we shouldn't show ourselves. And the body holds all of that. Just like with traumatic events, relational strife can be have to do with society as a whole too. Again, with privilege oppression dynamics, sexism, systemic oppression, and so forth. And I think what's really remarkable about the ways our bodies adapt is that the purpose is to maximize the available resources. Okay? family who thinks I should be seen and not heard, and these are my attachment figures that I'm dependent upon, my body might just adapt to that by pulling in and trying to be a little bit smaller, by lowering my gaze, because I get the most out of my family when I do that. So, what I like to call the somatic narrative, the story that the body tells, not the story with words, but the story that the body reveals. And that's the legacy of trauma, attachment, and privilege, oppression dynamics, and so forth. And if you look at each one of these bodies, you can just imagine each person had a different history, right? Why does this man in the middle look so puffed up as though he's ready for a fight? Somehow that physical organization, that posture served him. Maybe he grew up in a family where he was supposed to be really tough, where his vulnerable feelings weren't okay, right? It's very different from the woman next to him who's slumped over. Her body's collapsed. It's so fun to speculate what that means. It looks like she doesn't have much confidence, right? And the one on the far with her arms crossed like this, she looks a little bit like the body I was demonstrating of just hiding and pulling in. But we need to be aware of the meanings that we're making out of our clients' bodies, and also be aware of the sociocultural implications. For example, I was talking with an Asian American woman who had a body very much like that, just kind of pulled in and tighter. Her head was down. And as we talked about that, she said, my family was totally accepting of me. I felt so safe, and I could express myself. I could, say what I felt, what I thought, and they really supported me. But the culture didn't. And she said the pulled in that you see is because I felt really unsafe in society. She experienced so much discrimination and bullying because she was Asian American. So we have to be aware that it's not only the families that we grow up in that impact our bodies, but it's also the culture. And one way to think of it, just like the brain, Dan Siegel talks about that the brain is an anticipation machine. It learns from experience and anticipates the future. And if we look at each of these bodies, each one is anticipating a different future. Some look scared and pull in. Some look like collapsed and compliant. Some look ready to take on the world. They look tough. They're expecting something different, right? And what's really fascinating about that is that this communicates to other people. And because you can imagine, like if you met the guy with the puffed up chest in the middle, if you met him on the street, you would have a different reaction yourself than if you met the person next to him who's all collapsed. Because you would adapt to seeing him. He would have an impact on you. Right? And each body communicates to others. And it also communicates to ourselves. Like if you take on this collapsed posture, your head's forward and your posture's just slumped. I mean, I do that and I immediately, my voice even changes. I start feeling like I don't have much confidence. I don't feel very good about myself. So if I live in that physical organization, it's the constant communication to me too. So in sensori-motor psychotherapy, we work with the issues that got a person's body the way that it did, like with this collapse, and we help the issues change, but also the body change. This research from a woman named Dykstra and her colleagues, I think in Norway, where she showed that if you take on a certain posture, like the blown up posture, this collapsed posture, you will start to get in touch with the memories of when that posture was operational. So all the memories that got this woman to collapse her spine instead of facing the world with confidence and joy, they will start to emerge. So I think that's research is a big kind of plug for body psychotherapy that was shifting some of those patterns that limit us so much. So in sensori-motor psychotherapy, we help clients discover their somatic narrative, the story the body tells. We listen to their verbal narrative, but also help them discover the somatic narrative and then shift it to promote recovery from trauma and attachment failures and support resiliency in the face of ongoing trauma and depression. So we work both with posture and specific actions. Actions like reaching out, for example. Like if you just reach out your hand, your arm, if you just do it, I'm not going to demonstrate it because I don't want you to copy me. If you just reach out, notice how you do it. Notice if you reach, do you reach halfway, like this? Do you reach with a full extension? Do you reach with your palm down? Are you pulling back at the same time? John Bowlby, who's the father of attachment, he's considered the father of attachment. He taught us about proximity-seeking actions, of which one of them is reaching out. So the habitual way we just make that action tells a lot about our history. Look at these drawings here. These are drawings that are from actual clients. They're all different. These proximity-seeking actions, they are predictions of whether the other person is going to be there for us and respond to us in the way that we need. And look at the one with your shoulders up. This was a client who had severe abuse, grew up in an alcoholic family, was having real trouble having connections, even with her children. And she said in the session, she said, I'd like to reach out like this, but her shoulders came up in fear. The person next to her was a woman who had been kidnapped actually by her father, away from all the support she ever knew. She didn't have anybody to depend on. And she reached out with a stiff arm, pulling back at the same time. Can you see that in the drawing? And she's like, I don't expect anybody to be there for me. I always have to be on my own. So the one below, who's reaching out halfway, with shoulders up a little bit, that person said to me, it's like hopeless. Why would I reach out? Nobody's going to be there. So these actions have meaning, right? For the client, and for relationships. Like each of these people had real difficulty in relationships, and their bodies reflected the relational failures of the past, just in how they would reach out. So let's look at just sources of stress and trauma, because there are so many. This is really just a list, and it doesn't even include everything. But we have so many sources of stress and trauma in our lives. It's not just sexual abuse or loss of a loved one or assault. It's all of these accidents, transgenerational trauma, racialized trauma, So we're not going to talk about each one. But the thing about trauma is that no matter what kind it is, it's a threat. It's a threat to our safety and security. Each one of these are a threat to us. And when we feel threatened, first and foremost, our bodies are affected. It doesn't go even to our cortex. Like if you're falling down the steps, if you stumble and you're about to fall, you will grab for the railing from your subcortical instinctual brain. The signal doesn't even have time to get to your thinking brain, your neocortex, before you grab the railing, because this is another wisdom of the body that our instincts will take over in times of threat. So let's look at social location as well. Intersectionality was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how combinations, the intersection of these different social locations, will influence our lives. And it definitely influences how we experience trauma and stress. So, for example, in the United States where I live, if you're Black, if you're male, if you're undereducated, you have more factors that intersect, that means that if you have a trauma, it will affect you more deeply. And it also leaves you open to certainly some forms of trauma like systemic oppression, racialized trauma, and so forth. So we want to look at all this. Do our clients speak the language of the country? Like in America, we have lots of immigrants from Mexico whose first language is not English. They're discriminated against. They're targets of abuse, bullying, etc., etc. So we want to really consider where our clients fall in terms of social location, and consider it in terms of privilege and oppression, because that will affect the kinds and often the degree of trauma in a person's life. For example, my nephews who are Black, um, one of them especially, who lives in Colorado where I live, he has gotten stopped by the police so many times. My white son, I don't think ever got stopped by the police. So for somebody like him, just a police car could become a threat, right? For me, I have mostly privileged locations. I'm white, I'm educated, my English is my first language, I'm heterosexual, and so forth. The only marginalized or under oppression categories for me are that I'm a woman, so I have experienced a lot of sexism, and now I'm becoming elderly, and I'm starting to feel ageist. You know? So it's interesting to think about that for yourself and definitely for your clients, because we want to understand our clients' realities, and social location will tell us a lot about that. Like if you have a client who does not have privilege, for example, and you're working with them. I had this happen a few years ago, and with a Black woman, and she said in therapy, I just have to work twice as hard to get anything, to get into college, to get a good job, etc. And if you don't understand that that's true for marginalized people or underserved people or people who are discriminated against, you're likely to think the only source of that issue is her family, rather than it being true in a country where African American and Black people are discriminated against. It's well known they have to work really hard to get more, to get anything really. So let's look a little bit more at trauma. Let's look at what I call the modulation model. Um, I like this graph because it really can teach us about how trauma affects us, right, when we're threatened. Dan Siegel coined this term window of tolerance. So in the middle of that graph, between those two lines, that's the window of tolerance within which we feel present, we feel good, we can process whatever's going on inside, whatever's impulse stimuli from outside, without getting unduly dysregulated. And we like to live in this window pretty much. We like to go to the edges too and challenge ourselves, but in the window is a good place to live. But when trauma happens, our arousal shoots up to hyperarousal because that hyperarousal is preparing our body to defend and protect ourselves, to fight, flight, call for help, and so forth. So, but if the arousal doesn't settle, all the things under hyperarousal there become more pervasive. We become anxious, emotionally reactive. We might tremble. We might be hypervigilant, and so forth. And if we can't protect ourselves, our arousal can plummet to that low end, to hypoarousal. And that's really a shutdown state. I've had clients say, I just don't feel anything. I'm just completely shut down, barely able to stay in the room. And this is to fuel the pain death response that many survivors of trauma experience because they couldn't do anything to help themselves. All they could do was to go into this shutdown state, so at least they didn't feel so much what was happening to them. So the reason this is so important, because when we start to recognize how our clients' arousal or our own it really exceeds the window of tolerance, it exceeds our capacity to integrate. So the very first task as a trauma therapist, in my mind, is to help people recalibrate that dysregulated nervous system and bring arousal into that window. So we go from arousal being, unpredictable and jagged like that red line to being flowing and smooth within the window of tolerance. And then once you're there, you can start to work with difficult material. Because clients nobody can really think clearly or process clearly when the arousal is too high or too low because they can't integrate. So what do we do when the client is dysregulated? We work with somatic resources. Now, somatic resources are capacities of the body that contribute to our well-being, our confidence, our regulation. I think somatic resources are pretty common now, but I want to go over some of the essential ones. Breathing. Research shows that if you inhale, there's a little bit more arousal. Your blood pressure even goes up. On the exhale, the arousal goes down and your blood pressure goes down. So, I've often worked with clients to simply, if they're hypoaroused, to emphasize that inhale a little bit. If they're hyperaroused, to see about a deep breath. But I want to say something here because no one somatic resource works for everybody. I've had so many clients come in and say, my therapist just tried to get me a deep breath and I just couldn't do it. It didn't feel good. I couldn't catch my breath, and I wasn't able to do it. I just felt like a failure. And that's because often for a traumatized person, the diaphragm is really tight. So if you tighten up your diaphragm right here and try to take a breath, like you can't get there, right? So one of the things that sometimes is helpful is to just bend over a little bit because that helps the diaphragm let go, and then the deep breath might be useful to a person. Um, Often the box breath, the box breath is just you inhale for 2, 3, or 4 counts, hold it for the same amount, exhale the same number, and hold it for the same amount. So many clients find that helpful. I think it was really helpful to soldiers to help and people veterans with PTSD to help them bring arousal in. Grounding is simply to sense the support of the ground, the support of the chair. I often ask clients just to push down a little bit with your feet, which usually lengthens the spine, and that takes some of that energy that often comes up with hyperarousal and can bring it down. Right. So that is a great resource. And the reason these are so powerful is because the dysregulation of trauma is not a cognitive issue, it's a body issue. So in sensory-motor psychotherapy, we want to impact the body directly. Um, I've had so many clients come in and say, I try to tell myself I'm safe, I try to tell myself it's okay, but if their nervous system is so dysregulated, the words don't really affect the body in the way that they need. So orient to surroundings. This is this is a good resource because when people are dysregulated, their arousal is dysregulated, they're really living in what my friend and colleague Anno Vanderhart calls trauma time. They're living as if the trauma is still happening. So you can just look around the room to get into the present moment in the present space. I'll often ask clients, well, just look around, find something red. Oh, yeah, you got it. Now find something green, something blue. And this activates the orienting reflex, which is just, the orienting to our surroundings, being able to move our neck, our spines, look around, take in our present surrounding. And that can be very resourcing for many of our clients. Lengthening the spine is just gently sit or stand taller, reach upward with the top of the head. You don't want to use a lot of muscular force, but that woman we saw, the picture of her who was all collapsed, that could be a great resource. Just lengthen up a little bit in your body. My mom, when I was young, she used to make me walk around with a book on my head because she knew I was going to be really tall. I'm over 6 feet. And she was an artist, and she said, if you're going to be tall, you're going to be graceful. And I'm so glad that she did that. I didn't always like it as a child, but because it really helped me develop that capacity. And, there's research that shows when you're aligned in your body, your confidence and your well-being is increased when you have that alignment. So thanks, Mom, for that. Any kind of movement, and this is really good for hypoarousal at the bottom end of the window of tolerance because hypoarousal is an immobility response. People feel shut down like they can't move. I might just say to the client, let's just stand up. Let's stand up, walk around, let's move a little bit, sense your legs, sense your feet. Self-touch. Do this with me. Just maybe a touch like like this. I often have clients explore, like maybe this is a good touch, maybe you want your hands on your heart. Let's find a self touch that feels right to you. Um, and so, self touch, like human touch, it stimulates oxytocin, which is the social hormone that makes you feel, good with others. So that self touch can be very powerful, and it, it's soothing. Clients often want to like just do a little movement with that self touch. Smiling, I like to help clients find the kind of smile that feels right to them. Like, is it just a little smile? Is it a big ear to ear grin? Um, we know also that just smiling has effects in the body that can help arousal regulate. And then for many clients, we might practice this. I call it a stop sign, just hands in front. Because think about trauma. People weren't able to really protect themselves. So a defensive action, a stop sign, sometimes push against the wall, can be really helpful. But I want to say that there's no one size fits all. You've got to find and explore with your client until you find a somatic resource that really resonates with their body. Um, it's not, no client will find all these resources beneficial. So we make suggestions, we experiment, we do it with them until we get that click that something really helps them, and then that becomes the one that they work with in practice. So when triggers cause arousal to exceed that window, either at the low end or the bottom end, you want to use somatic resources to regulate as quickly as you can. When I work with racialized trauma or people that are experiencing the daily threat that goes with belonging to an oppressed and discriminated against group, because often our clients come to us saying that they had trauma in childhood, or a month ago they were mugged or whatever, and but the trauma's over now. But for people who are not accepted, um, and who are threatened in the society, the trauma is not over. So I want to teach everybody to recognize the signs of your arousal exceeding the window, and then do something to regulate as fast as you can. But this is critical, I think, for all of us, but especially for people who experience ongoing threat from society. Because if arousal stays dysregulated too long, it's really bad for immune systems. It can lead to all kinds of health conditions. So we all want to learn to regulate quickly through the body. So here's a little 5-step uh, uh, um, to change the brain and recalibrate the nervous system. This is what we teach in sensori-motor psychotherapy. To one, identify your triggers. Don't focus on them, but know what they are. Like for my nephew, a police card, right? Instead of focusing on the trigger, notice what happens in your body. Well, I tighten up, my heart rate goes a little fast, my fists are starting to clench. Then, 3, select one or more somatic resource to regulate arousal quickly. Okay, I can take a deep breath, I can ground and bring my energy down. And then this is the important part. Well, they're all important, but this part, to focus what happens internally. Oh yeah, my heart rate's slowing down. I feel more grounded. My shoulders drop. My fists let go, and savor that for 5 seconds or more. Because staying with it, and just savoring that positive effect is going to help change the brain and help create new, more resource pathways. And then 5 is just repeat this over and over and over and over until it just kind of becomes a habit. And then arousal won't stay dysregulated. All right, let's talk about what I like to call a paradigm shift. When I was learning how to do therapy in the 70s in social work school, all I learned was how to talk to a client. We worked with insight, we used a lot of words, we talked. Um, and then I met Ron Kurtz, and he taught me the wisdom of not relying on conversation, but to look at habits of thinking, habits of feeling, habits of in the body, because those habits are what is driving the content of the person's life, of the person's life. For example, if I had a client once who came to therapy and her posture was kind of like this, right? And she talked about never having a boyfriend, and it kind of made her angry. That really irritated her. She said, "They never stay with me; they always leave." And her energy was rising up. You could hear this kind of pattern of irritation, and you could hear the habit of thought: "Nobody's going to stay with me." Right? We could talk forever about what had happened with all these boyfriends, but what we worked with instead was this lift in your chin, like because I mean, imagine if you're dating, if you're in college and dating like she was, and you meet everybody with this kind of lift in the chin, that communicates a kind of arrogance, right? So she learned how to drop her chin, lengthen the back of her neck, and she also got a lot of insight. And there was some pain with this about how her father never accepted her vulnerability, just wanted her to be tough and kind of better than others. And that was the script of her childhood, right? So we're less curious about the content and more curious about what's driving the content, these patterns, these habits. So we do work with history, but more interested in the effects of the history on current time, like with that client, what she had embodied cognitively, emotionally, and in her body from all her experience with her father was really limiting the richness of her life. Um, so, how do we do that? How do you become aware of patterns? So, this is the shift from conversation. If we're not going to talk about stuff, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to become mindful. And I call the mindfulness in sensori-motor psychotherapy embedded relational mindfulness because it's not meditation. It's not done all by yourself. It's not like a group exercise or something. It's really embedded within the relationship. So this means that we're looking at what what we can call the building blocks of present moment experience in the moment. Like with the client with her head up, I said something like, "Well, when you talk about this, do you feel like your chin kind of goes up? Do you sense that?" She's like, "Yeah, I do." And so I said, "Well, how about we explore that? Because there's something there." And she agreed. So I said, "What happens when you put your chin up?" And she immediately got an image of her father. So that's five sense perception over here, that building block, this image of him. She got thoughts and beliefs around, I can't let anybody in, really. I can't soften. Emotion with that, we use the movement as the road in, and her sensation contributed as well. So that curiosity in the present moment help clients become mindful of these five building blocks because these five building blocks really comprise the organization of our experience. When she started, working through the emotion and the thoughts and changing her body and the image of her father and the sensation. We started working through that, and there was pain, and she remembered things that had hurt her. But all these things started to change. The chin came down, and so forth. So the experiment is just what happens when. You can start anywhere. You can say, what happens when you have this image of your father? What happens in your body? What happens when you have the thought, I can't let anybody in, and so forth. So then we just track and work with the organization of experience. How do these five building blocks change as we're working? Um, yeah, and if we're working with dissociative clients, different parts of the person are going to organize experience very, very differently. We'll talk more about that in a little bit here. So, mindfulness, as Dan Siegel says, and this is a really common definition, it's paying attention in the present moment without grasping onto judgments. So it's just this kind of general mindfulness. But in sensori-motor psychotherapy, we're using a directed mindfulness. We're directing the client's attention to particular building blocks, particular elements of internal experience that we consider important to therapeutic goals. Like I knew with that client, the chin, I hypothesized, I didn't know for sure until we explored it, but I thought that lift in her chin had some significance on her relationships with the men at her school. So I directed her mindfulness towards that lift. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the difference between resourcing and processing, because mostly we've talked about resourcing. Well, that last client with the lift, we were talking about processing. But, resourcing, we focus on resources to bring arousal into that window. So we do that through the body, but we also we might help clients develop a strength or a competency to regulate their arousal, to deactivate overactive instinctive defensive responses. And then they've got to practice. That was step 5 of the 5 step was do it over and over and over, because you got to practice it for it really to have an effect and change the body and the brain. Processing is different. This is when we're experientially accessing trauma or attachment issues, like with the client that was more of an attachment issue. We're helping clients really go into the memory to catalyze the effects in those 5 building blocks. So this we work with dysregulated arousal for sure, and the truncated defensive responses in trauma. And we have a few techniques of completing actions, regulating actions, and sensori-motor sequencing that I'm going to talk about. But I want to say first that, in our approach to memory, treatment focuses on the present moment effects of the memory. We don't spend a lot of time talking about the memory. We won't. I mean, clients need to tell their stories sometimes, and sometimes that's important for the relationship. But in sensori-motor psychotherapy, where we're going to get the change is tracking how talking about the memory stimulates change in those 5 building blocks, because retelling is reliving. You talk about something, you're going to start to relive it to some degree. So, for example, in working with a veteran who had PTSD from the war, when he started talking about the memory, he was like this, and you could see him, his arousal started to go up. So we just paused there because the memory had done its work. It had stimulated his dysregulation. We paused there, we used a resource to calm down, then we came back to the next bit of the memory. Um, so, uh, and one of the points in the memory for this same veteran was he said, I'm starting to feel panic. Um, and the difference between resourcing that panic and processing it on a body level is through a technique that we call sensory-motor sequencing. So, sensory-motor sequencing can recalibrate the nervous system, but it's different from just resourcing because we're letting the body find its way with its sensation and movement. So we use the memory, the narrative, to stimulate dysregulated arousal. So the client experiences a sensation of hyperarousal, right? And that's what this veteran was experiencing, this panic, and his arousal was starting to shoot up. So I asked him if he could just stay with his body and track and follow the sensations as they move through his body. And so I said, put the memory aside, don't even think about it. So he felt the sensation of trembling. He started to shake. His body started to tremble. You know, animals shake spontaneously after trauma, and I think it can be very healing. So he, his body did shake, and he was able to stay with it because he wasn't talking about the trauma anymore. If he had continued to talk about the trauma, his arousal would have gone up way too high. So he was able to stay with it. And you know, the body has its intelligence. It will almost always settle the arousal by itself when you can stay with it. Yeah. But I wouldn't want to try this intervention until the client um, had the somatic resources that they could trust to bring them back, right? Um, um, so, what this client did. So then, when the arousal comes back, it returns to the window. The body calms, the sensation calms, and then we can go to the next bit of the memory. Now, can you see how that's different from just resourcing? If it were a resource, I would have said, let's use a resource. Find a resource to calm that panic. But instead, we followed the wisdom of his body. So, in being able to capitalize on the wisdom of the body, I like clients to develop the vocabulary of their bodies. And this is just a list of body sensation vocabulary. Um, I think it gives them the words to describe their experience that are not charged words like terror. I feel terror. Well, so your arousal is going to continue to accelerate if you're going into the terror. But you can say, well, I'm trembling. There's a buzzy sensation. It's starting to radiate through my body, and this is really sensory motor processing when they can describe the words of what's happening in their body and track and follow those sensations. Really important with trauma, I think. Um, so let's come back to the modulation model because we also want to work with instinctive defensive responses. Cry for help, fight and flight, freeze, and feign death or shutdown, as you see on the slide. Um, I used to call these defenses animal defenses or primitive defenses. And then a friend of mine, Shelley Harrell, who's black, she said, you should think about those words because those words have been used derogatorily towards people of color historically. And I never thought of that because I never had to because I'm white. So I settled on instinctive defenses because these are instincts that are mitigated by a reptilian brain. We don't have to think about these. They're hardwired in our system. So there are four, well, let's talk about these three first: cry for help, fight, and flight. Those are mobilizing defenses that prepare our body to action. And we'll track these in our clients and ourselves. The cry for help has often, heightened eye contact. There's often have you ever had clients who just lean towards you and their eyes are like locked onto you? I always think of that cry for help. It's like a light, you're the lifeline. Fight and flight, of course, are in the jaw and the arms and hands for the fight, and the legs and the feet. Sometimes the spine for turning away for the flight. So retention or trembling sensation there. So those are all mobilizing defenses, and we have two immobilizing ones: freeze and feign death or shutdown. They're different. Maybe you'll do these with me so you can feel it in your body. The freeze, our bodies are alert. It's almost like we're like this. We're tight. Our bodies are alert. Sometimes there's hypervigilance. The body is very intense. But I have clients often say, "But I couldn't move. I couldn't move." Whereas the feign death, the shutdown, the body collapses. It's like the energy just drains out. But it's also an immobility response. Like we can't, often clients say, I can't move. But it's a different quality. They're like collapsed, more limp and placid. So what happens in trauma is that we develop patterns of response. Often if we've had childhood trauma that's inescapable and we couldn't fight back, we go to these immobilizing response because that's the only thing that worked. You ever had clients who have real trouble saying no? They can't defend themselves, protect themselves. They just go immobile. So what we want to do in sensori-motor psychotherapy is to get to reinstate the defenses that have been absent because they didn't work, and to regulate the ones that are overactive. For example, what's the next? No, that's okay. Okay, I just had to check my slides and I couldn't remember what came next. So if we remember the veteran and reworking his memory, there were three points of this really. One was there was one point where his hands came up a tiny bit like this, which is, if you think about it, if the hands come up, what do you think they wanted to do? Well, they wanted to protect himself. And so I held a pillow and he was able to follow that movement of his hands, like that stop sign, only this is like completing a fight, push away response, which he often wasn't able to do. We have to remember that anyone can have many traumas, but we only have one body and we develop habits of response. So we want to trust the body's intelligence. Like for the veteran, in combat, this motion wouldn't have kept a bullet away from him. But still, it's what his body wanted to do because he'd had many experiences where he couldn't protect himself. And so pushing against that pillow felt so good to him. Yeah. Another moment in his therapy was he said he just felt this anger and rage, and it was just felt like it was going to explode out of him. So we needed to regulate that impulse. He had attacks of rage and anger, as many traumatized people do, because it's a dysregulated fight response. So we worked with that he had a different motion. We want to trust the body with its motion. He had a motion like this with one fist. So again, I held a pillow, but I asked him to do it in very slow motion and to really tell me what was going on, because the mindfulness prevents his subcortical brain from taking over. through the mindfulness of being aware of what's going on in the present moment, and telling us, telling me, he stimulates his frontal lobes. So that completed that action that was so dysregulated. With freeze and feign death, well, wait, let's talk about flight first, because you probably want to know a little bit about all of these. With flight response, well, I'll give you two examples. One was with a person where we really needed to reinstate this flight response. She had dissociative identity disorder, severe views, and her legs were so tense, and she said she just felt stuck, like she couldn't move. So I asked her if we could just stand up and walk around the room, and if she could sense how her legs could carry her away from something, carry her towards something. So this was really working with a flight response, right? And then when she sat back down, she was surprised. She said, "Well, this feels so much better." She was much more resourced because doing that experiment mindfully told her she wasn't trapped. She could get away now. Another client, though, she had an overactive flight response. She moved every couple months. Her home situation. She couldn't stay in one place. She was always trying to get away. So we resolved that by working with boundaries, by helping her feel her space and keep things out, so reinstating a defensive motion. Um, and that helped her a lot. The cry for help is often uh, mitigated by reinstating other options like flight or fight. Right? So being able to make a stop sign and feel that you have the capacity to protect yourself. You're not a 3-year-old child anymore. You can make that motion. You're not dependent on somebody else to save your life, right? But we can also work with reaching motions, those proximity seeking actions that I mentioned. Now, freeze and feign death are both immobility responses. So both of those can be helped by any kind of movement at all. You can often track for those preparatory movements, like the lifting of the fingers, the turning away of the body, a movement in the legs that indicates that action wants to happen, and then you can help that develop for the person. So we want to. I think of it as really wanting for people to have all the resources of all these instinctive defenses in a regulated, effective way. And it's critical. Like I'm thinking again of people of color in the United States and in a lot of places. Um, we have the murders by the police of African American men here in the United States. And I mean, nephew and I have talked about this. Like, you've got to be able to regulate yourself in the face of the systemic oppression. Because if you get stopped by a police, you don't want to have a fight response coming up. You don't want to have that subcortical flight take over and start running, because it could literally get you killed. So being able to integrate and develop flexibility among these defenses, so that your body will instinctively choose the appropriate one for the situation, so that you're not susceptible to going right into a fight response, for example, or a freeze, or any of them. It can be so healing for trauma survivors. We do need to talk about something, though, that is complicated with the body, because internal parts of the self that develop after prolonged trauma. For many of us, for many people, they can have conflicting goals. For example, think of the goals of all those instinctive defenses. They're goals of protection, creating safety, staying alive. But think of goals of other systems, psychobiological systems like exploration or play or sexuality. They have different goals of connecting with others, being with others, and being in the world. Um, so, new actions, practicing new actions, just like new words, can be viewed as really threatening by certain parts of the self. Like, I'm thinking just even of posture, like, because we don't want to override parts, we want to integrate them. So I'm thinking of one client who had that collapse, and in the processing phase, we wanted to integrate that part of her that had collapsed. If we're on the resourcing phase, we might just do that alignment to help her feel better and then feel better, right? But if we want to integrate this part, I asked this client to just get the alignment just enough that that part that was held in the collapse, that you didn't override it, right? So it wasn't a full alignment. It was just a little bit where this part of her that kind of lived in that slump posture could be integrated and not overridden. In another example, I'm thinking of with a 13-year-old girl, her head was kind of held like this, right? And it represented this part that was really not confident at all. And my impulse was to just help her find that alignment, but she was also suicidal, bulimic. So she was an at-risk child. And I didn't want to override this part because I wanted to find out about this part. I thought that wanted to integrate it, especially since she was at risk. So we explored this part before we worked with her posture. And she connected with this part and shed tears of, sadness and grief that this part felt so bad. And then when we did work with bringing her head on, to on top of her shoulders and body, she felt really anxious in her stomach. Right? So what we discovered was that if she just placed her hands on her stomach, she could have a more integrated body, right? Because she was communicating with both parts, the part that wanted to have more confidence and the part that was anxious about showing herself with her hands there. She said she felt safe when her hands were there with that part of her. So it can, it's very interesting to discover how different movements, different postures relate to different emotions, and with the dissociative client, different parts, right? Different thoughts. All right, let's talk a little bit about trauma and relationship. Because, I kind of had to learn about trauma from my clients because I was really trained in a relational model back in the 70s. And if you think of trauma as overwhelming experiences of all kinds that can't be integrated, that elicit these subcortical defenses. Relational strife or developmental societal issues, it includes society too, their experience with other people that cause emotional distress but don't cause that severe regulation. Um, um, and then there's relational trauma, which is a combination of those two. But this is so important to me because I just learned how to work with relational issues when I was starting out. I didn't learn how to work with trauma. Nobody was talking about trauma in the 70s. So I kind of had to discover some things on my own about the difference, right? So with this slide, it kind of explains the difference between these two defenses, like the relational, attachment related social defenses. The defenses against rejection, abandonment, criticism, and their attempt to kind of maximize what the relationship has to offer, and it kind of limits some of the negative impact of painful emotions, right? Um, um, so we might develop to some degree a social facade, which is needed by all of us in different contexts. But trauma-related defenses are very different. They're those instinctive defenses against danger and threat that we've talked about, and they're needed in the face of danger. They're not needed when you're feeling safe or with others. That's not. You don't want your subcortical instinctive defenses to take over. So let's talk a little bit about the attachment system. Sometimes I think that you might want to use another word because what it really refers to are caregivers. Caregivers that we have when we're little. Um, uh, some of our clients might not have had even what they would call attachment figures. I've had clients who said, I didn't have anybody. This one person I'm thinking of, she said, I never had anybody to turn to ever in my whole childhood. Um, so, but it is this system of our first contacts that begins to organize our proximity seeking behaviors to secure our caregivers to come close to us. And so here we have more than just reaching out, we have facial expression, vocalizations, etc. Um, and these actions, like all actions, we're going to modify them without any, just unconsciously, according to the response of others. Right? So if we look at this next slide, we can see in these drawings how the proximity seeking actions have been modified by how each person was treated. Um, we talked about it already, right? This one hunching up, this tension, this one reaching halfway at the top. The man underneath is reaching out, but his eye gaze is turned away. So we look at the integration of the body's movement in terms of relationship, right? And because that gives us so much information about the patterns that have developed as a result of what's happened relationally. So, actually, I'm going to go back to that slide for a moment for a couple of reasons. Because this is what we explore these proximity seeking actions in working with relational issues. Like for the person on top and working with this woman in therapy, we processed all the grief and sadness of not ever feeling like anybody was going to care for her. She just kept saying there's nobody there. And memories came up and so forth. So when we're working with trauma, we're working primarily bottom up with the body. Because trauma, first and foremost, impacts the body. Right? When we're working with developmental relational issues that are not traumatic, meaning they don't cause arousal to dysregulate unduly, we're working not only with the body, but also with the strong emotions related to those relational experiences, and also the beliefs that form. Like with this top client, this top drawing, this client had beliefs like nobody will ever be there. Why bother trying to connect? And there's so much kind of grief and sadness, and we work with it through the body here. it's different working with these relational issues. Most, if not all, clients have both. So she didn't in our work, but she could have flipped into really strong dysregulation if she had, a traumatic history. She had just more people weren't there, which wasn't so extreme that it went to trauma. If her arousal would get really dysregulated, then we've got to work with the interventions for trauma, with regulating, with defensive responses, really focusing on the body. So it can change moment to moment in the session. Um, the other thing that I want to say about working with non-traumatic relational issues is that we can often use the body to exaggerate a certain pattern that will take the person into the meta level of that pattern rather than the content. Like with the lady, I had her exaggerate her chin lifting up a little bit, right? And then she got in touch with all those memories and everything. I'm thinking of another man who was depressed, but he wasn't traumatized, but he was depressed. And his body was slumped too. He had a shortened rectus abdominis. And I asked him to exaggerate that posture just a little bit. And he said, he doesn't cry. He said he doesn't get in touch with feelings. But exaggerating that posture took him into painful memories. And he wept. So the body can be very powerful in terms of accessing emotion related to those relational wounds that we all have. All right, so Aristotle says we are what we repeatedly do. So the way I think about it is that every waking moment we're practicing something in our bodies. We're practicing our hunched shoulders, or we're practicing a nice fluid breath, or we're practicing pulling back, because we all live in our bodies in certain ways. So the actions that we repeatedly do or don't do will affect our well-being. So in sensory-motor psychotherapy, we want to help people become mindful of these habits and really learn to live in their bodies in a way that enriches them and their lives. So I often think of hope in movement vocabulary, like all the different actions, the richness of how we can express with our bodies. Because we abandon movements and actions because they didn't produce the desired outcome. So people give it up. I had one client, a sex worker, who was repeatedly raped and said, there's just no point in even living. It had started very, very young. And there was the most powerful moment in her therapy that I remember is when her hands kept being like this over her genitals, really. But there was a lot of tension there, and every once in a while she would bring them up. And so I asked her if she would just be willing to push with these hands against the pillow. And she did, and she just came to life. And she said, "This is such a powerful feeling. I've never felt this before." And I asked her, to tell me more about it. And she said, "It just gives me hope. It gives me hope that maybe I could protect myself. Maybe I could not get raped again." And it was so touching how that movement restored the hope in her instinctive response of protection. Um, and you can think of that with any action, like the client who didn't reach out. Well, she eventually learned to reach out fully, to contact somebody else, to connect with them, to take in that support. So we can look at any movement that's not integrated in full and think about how can that be restored so that the client can recover discover the hope for the efficacy of that action. So, my friend Philip Bromberg, who passed away last year, he coined this phrase that I love. He said, therapy has to be safe, but not too safe. So we need to work at these boundaries where those jagged lines are at the window. We can't just stay in the middle, or we won't engage uncomfortable, challenging, or even dysregulating experiences. So it can't be too safe. But we don't want arousal to exceed that window too much either, because then we won't be able to integrate. The client will be dissociative. So working on the edge is tricky for us trauma therapists and therapists in general. But what happens when we work at that edge is that clients can go then from surviving to thriving, whether it's with trauma or relational strife. So this diagram shows how the window gets wider, right? So we learn to tolerate and even welcome a fuller, richer experience in ourselves and in our environment, right? The things that used to cause us to close up or retreat or shut down or whatever, they're not such powerful triggers anymore. A window gets wider. So I want to just spend a couple minutes talking about which really is, to me, the most important aspect of the work, which are these philosophical, spiritual principles that really guide sensori-motor psychotherapy. Many of these came from Ron Kurtz. Others I added or changed. But Ron was very interested in Buddhism and other cultures. So he introduced me to some of these principles. And I want to honor that these are really borrowed and appropriated in many ways from indigenous people and Eastern traditions, including mindfulness. I should have said that earlier. It's not talked about enough how we in the Western world have appropriated mindfulness for our own uses, and in that appropriation, it really changes the meaning and the way it was used in cultures where it was originated. So I do want to acknowledge that. So let's talk with organicity. Organicity is simply the trust that everyone has wisdom inside of them, and they have their own answers inside. If you just believe that, it's going to do wonders for a therapeutic relationship. It leads naturally to nonviolence. If your client has wisdom inside of them for their next step, then you don't have to figure it out, and you don't have to push them. All you have to do is help them, I think mostly through mindfulness, find that wisdom inside of themselves, right? That's why we help clients turn inward to discover their own habits and patterns. Unity, it's simply that we're all in it together. But with clients, it has a special impact on the relationship, because for me it means that I'm going to be really open with my client about what I'm doing, my interventions. I'm going to collaborate with them and ask them what do they think. Does this feel like the right path, etc. And really communicate with them, because this unity among us all is a given, but we strengthen it through the felt sense of it, I think, through communication. And it applies to therapy too, because we want to help different aspects of the client communicate, like the body and mind, right? The emotions in the body, and so forth. Mind, body, spirit holism, I think we've kind of been talking about that the whole time. One of my teachers, Ida Rolf, was fond of saying, well, the body's not the only thing, but it's the only thing you can get your hands on. But I feel that when we're always working with the spiritual self, all aspects of the self. So that's an important element. Relational alchemy is the newest principle, and it just describes a kind of alchemical magic that happens when two or more beings get together. And we all know those beautiful moments when a client transforms and changes in the therapeutic relationship that wouldn't have happened in the same way, and maybe not at all, with another client therapist dyad. So relational alchemy speaks to that, but it also speaks to the therapeutic enactments that emerge, where our as a therapist, our own material and unresolved issues, which all of us have, they will interface with the clients, and you'll get stuck. And Philip Romberg taught me that getting stuck like that is some of the most powerful spaces that you can enter in therapy, because you're negotiating. Then you have to relationally negotiate getting through that together. So, for example, I had an experience once with a client whose mother was very invasive. And my experience with my mother was that, well, my dad had died when I was really little, and I think she was just withdrawn, and I was always trying to reach her. So I was trying to reach this client whose mother was invasive. I was leaning forward. The client was just tightening up and, pulling back, and I couldn't figure it out. Because nothing I was doing was reaching her. Finally, I just had the intuition to move back a little bit. And I actually shut my eyes, and then she started to get some space from what she experienced as that invasiveness, right? So, but that was a really powerful moment for us in therapy, because we worked it together and we came through it together in our relationship. So, mindfulness and presence, we've talked a lot about mindfulness. I just want to distinguish it from presence, because mindfulness is a dual state of consciousness. Presence is a unified state. And when I'm working, I mostly feel just present right there with the client. Um, I'm not like observing my experience or noticing what's going on, as much as I'm just letting the relationship, the dyadic dance, unfold. So I want to make that distinction between a dual consciousness, which is mindfulness, and a more unified being present. So my attachment, yeah, I love these principles, and I feel like together they really create the maximum healing context for therapy, and they're always aspirational. I've been working with these for more years than I want to admit, and I'm still challenged by the intention to embody them. But I feel like when we can, they create this context where the healing intelligence of the client can come forward in therapy. So this context is essential in sensory-motor psychotherapy. I think it's the most important element. So I want to end with that. And thank you so much. If you want to find out more, go to sensori-motorpsychotherapy.org. Okay, thank you. Be well.